Daf Sabli He Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the bottom. Last thing we mentioned was a mahloket whether or not. So generally, the halacha is that if the owner is working with the borrower of the product, you're patur. The question we asked, which was mahloket whether yes or no, was what if the borrower was working with the owner, which generally be patur, but he was negligent with the animal, would he still be patur? Mahloket. One opinion said hayav, one opinion said patur. We're going to ask a question against the lenient opinion. Tan hashwel hapara v'shal be'aleha imah. Someone borrowed a cow and borrowed the owner with it for help. Hashwel hapara v'sachar be'aleha imah. If he borrowed the cow, then he hired the owner. Shal be'aleha uscharan, or he borrowed the owner and hired him. V'akach shal hapara, then he borrowed the cow. Umeta, and then the cow died. Patur, you're patur. Ve'ilu shomer hinam lo ktani. The thing is, it doesn't mention a shomer hinam. So what does that mean? The shomer chinam is only a hayav in cases of negligence. So since we didn't mention the negligence of a shomer chinam, since we never mentioned the shomer chinam, we would see that there is no such thing as negligence, non-liability, if the owner is with you. Question against the opinion is that you're patur. Gemara says, what does it mean? According to your concept, according to your reasoning, that if it didn't mention the shomer chinam by the concept shomer sachar miktani, it doesn't mention a paid shomer either in the Mishnah. It doesn't mention anything about a paid shomer, and a paid shomer is also chayav when it's negligent. Ela Tana, therefore the Tana of our Mishnah is mentioning it only mentioned cases that was specifically mentioned in the Torah, which was the case of the borrower. The At Midrasha, but the other cases of other shomerim, which we learned through Drasha, Laktani didn't mention it. Next question. Tashma. She'alha v'she'al ba'alai ma. If you borrowed the cow and the owner, Sachara v'sachar ba'alai ma, you rented it, you rented the owner. She'alha v'sachar ba'alai ma, or if you rented the cow and borrowed the owner. Afal pi. She'haba'alim osim l'achab makom acher. Even if the owner is working elsewhere, where the cow is working, umeta, and it dies, patur. You're still patur. Savrua, now we're assuming from here, Mani was according to the Bidah Hida Amar, according to the Bidah that holds, so Socher Keshomer Sachardami, that a renter is like a page watchman, like we mentioned earlier, and therefore this Tana is bringing it down a halacha that's mentioned through Drasha, not through the Pasuk, and therefore it didn't mention the case of an unpaid watchman, and we see from here that the unpaid watchman is the concept of negligence, and it should be chayav in negligence. So we see we're trying to bring all that down to show you that you're still chayav in negligence against that opinion. The Gemara says no. It's going to the Meir that holds renters like an unpaid watchman in regarding to responsibility. And when the Tana was mentioning the shomer chinam, and the same thing would apply to a paid watchman, and therefore it's teaching you everybody would be patur from negligence if the owner is there. Different answer. In that which Rabba bar Avua switched the opinions of Meir and Yehuda. How does renter pay? Meir holds like a paid watchman. Yehuda mer shomer chinam, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that it is like a shomer chinam. We had this previously as well in Baba Kama and in Baba Mesiah multiple times about how these opinions were switched. Therefore, this Braita can follow Rabbi Yehuda to teach you that when it says that the owner is with him, it applies even by a shomer chinam and even by negligence. Amar Rav Hamnuna, the Olam hu chayav, a borrower is always chayav when the owner is there, ad sheteher para v'choresh ba, unless the owner is there using the cow and plowing with the cow. Hamor if they borrowed a donkey and they borrowed the owner, and the owner is walking the donkey. He has to be the owner from the beginning of the borrowing until the animal got injured or died. Alma Kasavar, therefore we see it Runa holds Ba'ala v'mo akula miltei mashma. When the pasuk says the owner is with him, it means from beginning to end. We have a problem with that. Mati Rava has a question. She'ala v'she'al ba'ala ima. If the brother says that if you borrow the owner and with the animal, Sachar v'she'al ima, if you rented the cow with the owner, Sachar v'she'al ima, if you rented the cow and borrowed the owner, She'ala v'sachar b'ima, or if you borrow the cow and hire the owner, even though specifically we see if the owner is working elsewhere, umeta and it dies, patur. It sounds like even if it's working on something completely different, if he's working on the vineyard and the cow's working on the grain, you see patur. It's a question against Rav Huna that says it has to be directly working on the same thing. The Gemara says lo be'otam melachas, referring to the same labor. The Gemara says okay, so we need a different place. Sounds like a different location. The The owner was true. He wasn't working directly with the animal, but he's ahead of the animal. It's loosening the ground before the animal comes to make it easier. So it's true. He's not actually working with the animal, but he's working in conjunction with the animal. Okay. But the problem is that the later part of the mentions that the owner is working in the same conjunction, which sounds like the Bresha sounds like something completely different. For the second part of the Brayta says, even though the owner is plowing with it, he dies. So therefore, since in the second part of that Brayta shows the owner is working with the animal, so we see that the first part of the Brayta where we mentioned that he's working somewhere else sounds like he's working in a completely different location, and you'd be patur, questioned against Rav Hamnuna. Gemara says, the first and second cases are both talking about the owners with the same thing, working with the cow. Each part of the Brayta has a hidush. The hidush of the first part is the afagav, the lav al gaba, even though the owner is not working exactly with the animal, but rather he's just helping out with the same type of labor. Since, however, the owner was working at the time of the borrowing, patur. The hidush of the second part of the Brayta is the afagav, the al gaba, even though the owner is working with the animal, even if the owner was not in the service at the time of the borrowing, haya. Right? So the first part of the Brayta is referring to where the owner and the cow are working together. Haimai, how do you say this is the two separate halachot in the Brayta? Alright, it's a completely different concept in the same Brayta. Very interesting idea. It makes sense to say that the first part of Brayta is referring to where different labor completely than the cow. And the second part of Brayta is referring to the same labor. That's enough of a hidush. But if you want to tell me that the first and second part of the Brayta is teaching me that they're in different labor, what's the hidush? It's technically the same type of labor. Therefore, it makes more sense to say that the first part of the Brayta is referring to completely different items, and you're still patur. And the first, and what Rav Hamnuna said regarding that the animal and the owner to be working together is knocked out. V'otani have another Brayta against Rav Hamnuna, as we're packing it on him. From what the pasuk says that. If the owner's with him, you don't pay. Anymore. It sounds like obviously that if the owner's not with them, he has to pay, like a normal borrower. Why does the pasuk have another pasuk telling you the owner's not with him? To teach you, the owner has to be with the borrower, helping at the time of the borrowing. It does not need to be with the borrower at the time of the injury or death. Now, and that's enough to be patur. The owner was with him when the injury or death happened. He also has to be with him since the beginning. So we see that the Brayta is going against Rav Hamnuna again, that you don't need to be with the service of the borrower from beginning to end, per se. Another part of the Brayta that also knocks out Rav Hamnuna. Another Brayta says, the pasuk said already that if the owner is with him, you don't have to pay. If the owner is not with him, you have to pay. So obviously, if the owner is with him, you're patur. To teach you the following: once the owner left the lender's control, the animal left the lender's control and entered the borrower's control, with the owner helping out even for a second, the animal dies, patur. Another question against Hamnuna, we officially refuted that Hamnuna, we piled on him 3 in a row. Abaye savar la kreboshia. Abaye holds like kreboshia in regarding to the concept of the letter vav, right? The vav whether it connects the beginning and end of a pasuk, and or does it make it into an or that disconnects it? Umateres la kreboshia, he answers the pasukim like kreboshia. Rava savar la kreboshia. Rava holds like kreboshia regarding the vav. Umateres la kreboshia, he answers the pasukim like kreboshia. What's going on? Very good, the Gemara will explain. Abaya said the following. The owner is not with him, he shall pay. It sounds like the pasuk is saying you're chayav, the borrower is chayav, because the owner is not helping in the beginning and end. It sounds like that if the owner is with him at one point, yani the beginning, or at the end, and not at both, patur. But the pasuk says that he has to be with him. That was when you're patur. That sounds like the only time you're patur is if the owner's with him at both points. It sounds like if you're one-on-one, you're chayav. So, two different inferences from the Pesukim. So what does it mean? The Malachar teach you. If the owner's with him at the time of the borrowing, he does not need to be there at the time of injury or death to be patur. And but if the owner was there at the end at the time of the injury or death, he has to have been there from the time of borrowing in order to be patur. Rava Savar Kabir holds like Rabbi Yonatan, teach you as follows. Umtres like Rabbi Yonatan. Owners with him, you're patur. Sounds like the only reason, it's the only way you're patur is only if the owner is there at both times. Right, we're literally the same Pesukim and same questions, but different way of explaining it. It sounds like if you're there one and not the other, either beginning or end, patur. Pasuk also says, the owner is not with him, you're chayav. It sounds like the only reason you're patur, it sounds like you're chayav if the owner is not there at both times. It sounds like if you're there at only one of the times, the beginning or end, you'll be chayav. So how do you explain the Pesukim of that contradiction? To teach you that if the owner is there at the time of borrowing, and is not to be there by the injury. But if you're there when he got injured or died, he has to have been there as well at the time of borrowing. Right? The Rabban and Rab will agree to that concept. Okay, now the Gemara says, maybe you could say the opposite. Maybe the owner only needs to be there at the time of the injury and not at the time of borrowing. The Gemara says, Mistavra she'ela adifa. It makes more sense that the borrowing time is the exception to the Petur more mishum de kamaiti la b'shta, because that's when the borrower is getting it. So if the owner's with me when I borrow it, I'll be patur if something happens to it. The says adrab, the opposite. It makes more sense to the owner to be there when the injury or death happens. Shekan hayab ba'onsin, because at that point that's when the actual injury happens, and that's when the chiyub takes place. So that's when you should patur. Only if the owner is there at that point. The Gemara says, "Ilo she'ela that doesn't make sense, because if we don't look at the borrowing point, there's no borrowing, then there is no make difference with the injury. The Gemara says the opposite. Opposite. If there's no injury or death, who cares when you borrowed it? So the Gemara says, okay. No, borrowing time is more important. The owner is there to be patur. Because that's when the custodian takes responsibility for feeding it. Ravashi proves it from Pasuk. A man shall borrow from his friend. The letter not his friend himself, not the owner Yani. Shall pay. But the owner is with him, you're patur. So we see from here that it's talking about borrowing. That's when you're patur. Why is it necessary to teach me two Pesukim about it with him and not with him? If it had not been for both of them, I would think that's just the normal way that the Torah speaks and not giving you instructions. Meaning, if it just meant from your friend, we wouldn't have learned anything. Therefore, the two Pesukim teaches you if the owner was not with him, and if the owner is with him, to teach you the following thing: that the only time you're patur is if the owner is there at a certain point of time. And then once you see that, then the pasuk of from his friend teaches you that it has to be from his friend when his friend is there in order to be patur. We have a bunch of very, very interesting questions that we don't really necessarily answer. Someone borrowed an animal to sodomize it, to commit bestiality. What's the halakha? Is that considered regular borrowing or not? Because why? Do we require that the borrowing has to be like a normal borrowing, like plowing? And over here, he didn't borrow for normal borrowing or normal plowing. Or maybe perhaps he's chayav for a different reason. Mishum hana, because the borrower gets it for hana. Over here, he is getting disgusting hana. What if a guy borrows an animal to appear wealthy or hashub? He borrows 1,000 cows to be hashub. Is that considered regular borrower halachot? In order to consider borrowing something as a borrow something that has value, and he did. Maybe you have to borrow something in order to use it, and over here he's not using it. Next question. If someone borrowed an animal to perform a task worth less than a piruta, what's halacha? You still consider chayav as a borrower or not? You have to borrow something that's considered valuable, and he did. Maybe you should be chayav. Or maybe if you're borrowing it for less than the piruta worth of stuff, that's not considered a borrowing. Next, let's say you borrow 2 cows to each of them do a combined work of 1 piruta. We go borrow after the borrowing and lending since you're borrowing and lending an item for use, it counts. Or you go after the actual cows that are being borrowed and after their value of what you're getting from them. And each of them you don't have enough value for a piruta separately. So would you be chayav as a borrower or not? We don't answer. Let's say borrowed a cow from partners, 2 guys who own a single cow. And one of the partners helped out. So Mahu, what's the halacha? Bomb question. Do we need the entire ownership in order to patur? Over here, only one of them. Since that guy that helped you was there, maybe she patur 50%. Let's 2 partners borrowed a cow, and one of them borrowed the owner as well. Do you need that the entire borrowage needs an owner helping? Only here you only have. Maybe the owner, the partner that borrowed the owner should patur, and the other guy should be chayav. Next question. If you borrowed from the property that belonged to a woman before marriage, then you got her husband to help, or vice versa. If a woman borrowed a cow, and the cow's owner were sent to help the husband. Is the ownership to the property? Is the right to the owner? Is the right to the fruits of the property considered ownership or not? Meaning, because the husband has rights to the fruits, there's a machloket whether or not that is considered ownership of the property itself. So, therefore, if it is, then the owner is with you. If it's not, the owner's not with you. Go and be borrowed with my cow. And I'm running out my cow, my shliach, you go help the guy with the cow. I don't want to go. Do you need the actual owner patur as considered for a borrower with the owner? Over here it's not. Or when you say a shliach like the owner, a shliach like a person himself, the extended hand, and therefore ve'ika, that'll be patur. Regarding the husband and wife, is machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish. Shaliach pluta Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shia. Regarding Shaliach, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shia. So what does that mean? Baal pluta Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish. Regarding the husband, machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish. The 8th one, the Brita says, someone sells his field to his friend for the fruits. Rabbi Yochanan said that the purchaser brings the pikurim to say the pisukim at the Bet HaMikdash. Right? There's a certain pisukim you have to say. So this guy would bring it, because he owns the fruits, even though he didn't grow them. He brings the fruits, but he can't say the pisukim because he didn't grow it. Therefore, we see that he has ownership. He does not have ownership. First, Rabbi Yochanan holds that you say the pisukim because once you own the fruits, you own the property. Therefore, you say the pisukim. Rish says you don't say the pisukim because even though you own the fruits, it's not considered ownership. Regarding the shliach, the machloket between Rabbi and Shia, the time the Brita says, someone tells the administrator, you're I'm leaving. Right? You are my shliach. When I leave, until I get from New York to New Jersey, any nedarim that my wife makes, revoke it. Right? A husband has the power to revoke his wife's nedarim, so he's making a shliach to do it. And he did it. Maybe you might think it works to be mafir. Isha, her husband shall do it. And over here it's not the husband. No. We see in general that a shliach is like a person himself, and therefore it can be working. Go and be borrowed with my cow. Mahu, what's the halacha? Is the eved considered the exception like the owner or not for the borrower? According to the hold that the shliach is like himself. Also a question according to the hold that the shliach is not like himself. How? According to the hold that the shliach is like the person himself. Maybe that only applies to shliach, the bar mitzvah, because he's able to do mitzvot. But an eved kanani, the lad bar mitzvah, he has no mitzvot. maybe not. Maybe he can't. Look, maybe he can't be that shliach to make that ownership patur by a borrower. Or dima. Even if opinion holds that the shliach is not like the person himself, like in our case, hani milia shliach is by a shliach. Aval eved ban eved yad eved kied rabodam. A slave's hand is like the master's hands. Maybe, like the master would be patur if he's there. So now that the shliach is there with the borrowed cow, it would also make him patur. Amar le, he answers back to him. Rava says, mistavreyat eved kied rabodamya. It's logical to say that the slave's hand is like the master's hand to make him patur, and therefore, if he's there, the bar will patur if anything happens to the cow, just like the owner was. Amen.